Hey everyone, welcome to the webinar on xVA modeling overview in Python. Before we get started, a little bit about myself. So I'm Satya. I lead the market risk and counterparty credit risk course in Peaks to Tails, as well as I have taught quant finance as well as machine learning. Yeah, so today's session is about xVA modeling over in Python. So basically, it's part of the market risk and counterparty credit risk course that is currently live. At the moment, we have pretty much wrapped up the market risk aspect, which is FRTB, and the module that is pending is counterparty credit risk. So what you're going to see today is the overview of xVA, which we will be doing in the course over the next couple of months, I guess. So yeah, so let me set the expectation right away. This session is obviously not about a detailed deep dive into xVA because the time is short, and xVA is something that takes many months or even years to get your head wrapped around it. And the other thing is, this is also not a hands-on Python session. So what this session is all about is I will give you the overview of xVA. What are the main components of xVA that you need to know? We will also familiarize ourselves with the various formulas that are used for different calculations. And yeah, basically to give you a good foundation of xVA so that later on at your own pace you can build upon it. So that's the intent of today's session. All right, let's get started. So this session is into two parts. In part one, we will do a theoretical discussion. We will look at various definitions and various formulas and understand the theoretical underpinnings and arguments behind each and every calculation. And in part two, we will do a simple Python implementation, nothing complicated. We'll take a simple use case and try to calculate xVA. All right, so that's the agenda. Let's get going. Okay, so before we start, when we talk about xVA, it involves derivatives, right? Now, when it comes to derivatives portfolio, we have various entities, and it is important to understand the interrelationship between various entities. So this is more like from an architecture perspective. Those who are working as architects or business analysts, they would know about entity relationship diagrams, how different tables are related, right? What are the relationship, one-to-one, one-to-many, many-to-many. So that helps. Okay, so this is a plain vanilla, landscape of entity relationship, but in practice, it will be, highly complicated. So first and foremost, we have a derivative trade, right? One instrument. And what kind of attributes it will have? It will have value of the trade right now, which is also called as mark-to-market value. Asset class could be any kind of asset class, right? Interest rate, FX, or equity, commodity. So those are the asset classes. And there'll be various other attributes also, right? Time to maturity, and the type of the instrument itself. It could be a forward, it could be an option, it could be anything, right? So that's the trade. Then the trade's price or the value is driven by a bunch of risk factors, which are essential because from a modeling standpoint, we start from here. We model the risk factors and then go from there. Either it's a valuation use case or a risk management use case. We start with the risk factor. What are the risk factors? The risk factors could be equity spot rate or equity volatility surface, forward rates, commodity spot prices, FX spot, a bunch of things. Okay. Now, naturally, when you have a derivative trade, we have two counterparties. So on this side, we have the bank, and on this side, we have the counterparty. In today's discussion, you are the bank. Okay, so I'll use bank and you interchangeably. So picture or position yourself in the bank shoes for today, just for today. Now, these guys will have some attributes, right? So they are defaultable institutions. So they will have their own PD term structure, recovery rate. Bank will have its own funding curve. This is important for today's discussion. Similarly, counterparty would also have his own, CDS term structure, PD term structure, recovery date, etc., etc. Then, to reduce the counterparty credit risk, we have different types of credit risk mitigants. Credit risk mitigants help us to reduce the risk. There are two main types of CRMs. Okay, when we say CRM, don't confuse it with customer relationship management, because that happens for the first time. In risk management, we use CRM. CRM stands for credit risk mitigants. Okay. First one is netting. It's a very simple but powerful idea. So basically, we do not value the trades on a standalone basis. We simply add them under a netting set, so that the overall exposure is kept at a minimum level. It doesn't blow up. Okay, positive negatives can cancel. In some trades, you owe the money to the counterparty. In some other trades, counterparty owes the money to you. Overall, within that netting set, you're allowed to do a plain vanilla sum of the values. Okay, that way your exposure in either direction is minimized. And the direct way to control this is to have collateral, which is kind of like a backup. And there are different types of collaterals. We have initial margin, also called as independent amount. So this is like a safety deposit, right? When you go for renting a house, initially you pay some 2 months security deposit, right? That is incidental, just in case you go away or you damage. In our case, if you default, then we will have the initial margin to recover the loss amount. This initial margin is independent of the current valuation of the derivative. It is tied to the volatility, how much you can lose over a certain period of time. So there is a calculation behind it. And some of you might be knowing the gold standard for OTC derivative is ISDA SIM. Exactly. So standard initial margin model. That is something we'll cover in our course later on. So that is so basically what I'm trying to say is this is the independent amount, not tied to the daily variation, mark to market variation of the derivative. Variation margin is the one that is coupled tightly with the daily mark to market variation of the derivative. Okay, so this is variation margin that you on margin call, if you owe the money, then you have to transfer the collateral, okay, based on the value of the derivative. And then we have some other controls. These are like TH or MTA. TH stands for threshold. MTA stands for minimum transferable amount. These are collateral frictions, okay? And the purpose of this is to reduce operational cost. Simple idea. Idea is, if I owe you $1 tomorrow, do you expect me to transfer $1? And then tomorrow again, you owe me $5, you'll transfer $5? Doesn't make sense. These are small amounts, right? We don't need to transfer all these small amounts, because otherwise it will be too much transaction frequency that will lead to transaction cost. So we have these frictions, okay? Only if your exposure is higher than threshold and the amount you're supposed to transfer is higher than the minimum transfer amount, then you'll make a collateral transfer. So this is to improve the operational efficiency. So that's at a high level, the various types of tables that you will see in a bank, which will hold the data, and these tables are interconnected with each other. Okay. All right, let's proceed. I hope there are no questions. Now, first and foremost, when we talk about derivatives or derivative pricing for that matter, all the time we read in textbooks is the risk neutral valuation. That is the starting point. So let's do a quick refresher on risk neutral valuation. In risk neutral valuation, we have something called as money market instrument, a bank account, right? A bank account that grows at a risk-free rate. All right. So this is the differential equation. Initial value of the bank account could be $1. It can be anything. It just acts as a scalar. For convenience, I've taken as the initial value of the bank account is $1. Okay. And this is the growth equation. Right. It is deterministic. There is no randomness in it. Okay. And then you integrate to have, get the value of the bank account at any time t, which is given by e to the power this. All right. So this money market instrument is a fundamental necessity when you are doing valuation, because if you're familiar, we rely on no arbitrage arguments. We make the portfolio risk-free. Then, because it is risk-free, it has to grow at a risk-free rate and things like that, right? In Black-Scholes world, the specific adoption of this is in this manner. We assume the risk-free rate is totally constant R throughout. And, if it is a constant, it will come out. So the value of the bank account is simply e to the power RT, exponential growth rate. Okay. And then we have a risky asset, which is the stock, let's say, follows geometric Brownian motion. And you correct for the drift term because pricing is done under risk neutral world. So you have to have a risk neutral growth. You cannot have real drift. It has to be a risk neutral drift. R, same as the bank account. And then you solve for the stock price. This is the random stock price value at time t. You can see Z here. Z is the standard normal. And this is the one that is responsible for the randomness of the stock price in future. And then value of, let's say, any derivative. Okay. Value of the derivative at time t equals 0 is expectation under risk neutral density, which is Q. Expectation of what? Expectation of discounted payoff. This is the basic theory that everybody goes through when we read about derivative pricing, right? Expectation under risk neutral density of discounted payoff. That's the price, okay? And this was the gold standard. It came in 1973, and this is sacrosanct, right? When it comes to derivative pricing, this is a very, very elegant structure, the entire pricing argument, and everybody pretty much follows this. Okay, so this was golden. And if the rates are stochastic, so we assume a rate is constant. So if under constant risk-free rate assumption, you can take this term outside of the expectation because this is deterministic. But if the rates are stochastic, that means rates follow some kind of stochastic process. Then you need to modify the formula. So basically, this integration will remain as is. You cannot do anything. We retain this formula. And we have to, identify some kind of model to model the rate. You must be familiar. We use Vasicek model. There are a plethora of models for interest rates, right? It's kind of interesting. For stock price, we have geometric Brownian motion. But for interest rates, we have like more than 10 different models. Vasicek model, CIR model. Then we have no arbitrage models like Holy, Hull and White, 1-factor, 2-factor. Lots and lots of models. Okay, so this much was well understood. It is very well grounded in literature. And it's completely analytical. Everything checks out. No issues so far. Now what happened? What happened is, I'll tell you a story, okay? But at the moment, you start thinking of derivative pricing as a manufacturing process. What do I mean by this is, when you want to price a product, right, it needs to reflect all the costs and benefits, okay? Not just the base price. Depending on who is manufacturing, right, which party is involved, for them, the price may be very different because for them, the cost and benefits are different. All right. How sound is this logic? That is debatable. So today we are discussing xVA. xVA is the most controversial, debatable topic till today. Okay, so we'll get to those slowly and steadily. Now let's see this. So this is the pricing formula, but it does not talk about any kind of, does not reflect any cost or benefits, okay, which are specific to the counterparties involved. So what we do is we basically keep the risk neutral pricing as is, because this is so elegant. We don't want to mess with it. Don't adjust the pricing formula in the risk neutral valuation because this is very, very elegant. We want to keep it as is. And then as a post hoc adjustment, we want to adjust for all the cost and benefits that are missed in this calculation, okay, as an afterthought. So now we are looking at a pricing formula, which is this. Start with the base price, which is the risk neutral valuation that we just looked at. It could be, Black-Scholes option price. That's a risk neutral valuation. Plus all kinds of adjustments that are specific to that trade, to that counterparty, right? That affects you. So that's the thought process. All right. Okay. Now let's do a deep dive. First and foremost, you need to understand how to calculate various exposure metrics. Exposure metrics are fundamental building blocks for all the valuation adjustments. So let's look at that. So when A and B are the two parties that get into a trade, we have a bilateral exposure, obviously, because this is derivative. So exposure swings both ways. Exposure swings both ways. It's not the plain vanilla loan instrument where only bank has exposure. This is derivative. Okay, today I owe you money, tomorrow maybe you owe me money, right? Bilateral exposure. Now, the value of the derivative at time 0, let's call it V0. Normally at inception, the value is 0 for, let's say, swaps or forwards. But then to keep it more general, let's say that the value at time 0 is V0. Over the course of time in future, the value of the trade will go up and down. It is stochastic, right? So here is a bunch of Monte Carlo simulation paths to show you that the value of the trade can take, can be anything in future. Now focus at a particular time point in future t. At that point, the value is random, Vt. That's a random quantity. And it will have some kind of distribution at every point in future. Here also it has some distribution. Here also it has distribution. Only at time t0 it is deterministic. You know the value right now. In future it has a distribution. Now, given this distribution, you can calculate various exposure metrics. So let's go through them one by one quickly. Again, today's session will be very quick and dirty kind of introduction to xVA. This is not a master class. It takes a lot of time to master this, but we will be covering all of these topics in detail in the course, which is due soon. Okay. So first and foremost, we have V0, which is the current exposure or mark-to-market value of the trade. Vt is a future value of the trade at any time t, which is a random quantity. Now, you simply take the mean of this distribution, that is EFV, expected future value, simple, which is the expected value of Vt, expected future value. Then, we define positive exposure as max of Vt, 0, or the shorthand is Vt plus, which means if exposure is positive, we take it as is. If exposure is negative, we take it as 0. Okay, it is floored at 0. Okay, we only take the positive part. And the inspiration behind this is you as a bank have counterparty credit risk only if counterparty owes you money. Okay, if you are losing, then you don't have an exposure. Counterparty has an exposure. When you are winning, or you are in the you are suppose you are long option, and option is in the money, and you are winning, counterparty owes money to you, your exposure is positive, only then you have counterparty credit risk. That's why we are interested in positive exposure. That is the inspiration. Okay, so if it is negative, we don't bother. If it's negative, value of the trade is negative for you, then there is no counterparty credit risk. Question from Abhishek: when we forecast the Vt in future, do we do constrained Monte Carlo? There are a couple of approaches. You can directly simulate the value of the trade. And there is, if you are familiar with SSCCR, that is what they assume. They simply assume it is normally distributed. But the traditional way to deal with this is to start from the risk factor Okay. Risk factors can be modeled using their preferred Monte Carlo simulation, and then you price the derivative, and derivatives will have their own distribution. We will see that in Python. So we will do an end-to-end exercise for IRS, interest rate swap, because that is the, I think, the most interesting instrument, right? Options and forwards are actually boring when it comes to the exposure profile. So follow-up question, I do not want to below zero. That is why, no. You simulate VT as is. VT can be positive, negative, right? Plain vanilla exposure swings both ways. It can be positive, negative. There is no constraint on that. But then after you have done the simulation, to carve out the positive exposure, you do this operation. Take the positive ones, replace the negative ones with zero. So that is later. First simulation exercise will not involve any constraint. Okay, you simulate as is. We will see that later. Okay, great. So we have positive exposure. Similarly, we have negative exposure. Now, negative exposure is minimum of VT comma 0. That means if VT is negative, then we will take the negative value. But if it is positive, we'll take 0. Exact opposite of this. And now this is important for our counterparty, because when the exposure is negative for us, counterparty is winning. Counterparty has counterparty credit risk to us. Okay. So negative exposure is relevant for the counterparty. When you have negative exposure, then counterparty has counterparty credit risk to us. All right. Okay. So these are the some of the initial calculations that you have to do, and then there are more calculations. Expected exposure. Now, in some textbooks, you will find this, so there is a little bit of confusion in terms of how they define these terms. Sometimes you will find expected positive exposure for this. I prefer EE, expected exposure. Expected exposure is about taking the expectation of the positive exposure. Okay. Plain vanilla expectation, see, plain vanilla expectation of the value is EFV, expected future value. But when you say expected exposure, it is only considering the positive exposure. Take this and then take expectation. Okay. So in this picture, what I'll do is below this, there will be negative part. Replace all those as 0. Keep the positive part as is. Then take the average. That is expected exposure. All right. Okay. Next, expected negative exposure. Idea is same. Basically, you take the expectation of the negative exposure part. All right. Then we have potential future exposure. Potential future exposure is, if you look at this distribution, normally in risk management, what do? Let's say we're calculating 10-day value at risk. We need a P&L distribution of the portfolio for 10 days. In 10 days, what does the profit and loss profile look like, right? And then you cut a quantile, a severe quantile, to reflect a worst case loss. Here, similarly, from a counterparty credit risk perspective, you are worried that if your exposure goes up significantly, then counterparty owes you a lot of money, right? So it's all about how big this positive exposure can be. You're not worried about the downside from a risk perspective, okay? So the PFE, which is potential future exposure, is exactly like value at risk acting on this distribution, but in the opposite direction. Think of this as an upside VAR. Okay. Normally VAR is downside, right? You're talking about loss. Here I'm talking about extremely high positive exposure. So I'll cut a 95% quantile somewhere here, and that will give me the potential future exposure. Okay. Question from Sashish. When we take an average, we consider negative values as 0 or ignore negative values? No, we actually take negative values as 0. So this is a rookie mistake. I have also done before when I was doing this for the first time. But then later I realized, no, it's actually, you replace the negative values as 0. You take those as 0. Okay, you don't drop them. Okay, good. All right, so this is PFE, and then we have some more quirky exposure metrics. EPE is very natural, expected positive exposure. You know what? Actually, this T does not make sense. There's a typo. Forget about this T. EP. So see, all of these are function of T. That means where you're standing, at that point, you have an entire distribution. On that distribution, you are calculating all of these metrics. EPE is actually average of the EE profile. Average of the E profile over the entire life of the instrument. Okay, so T belongs to 0 to T. That means over the entire life of the instrument, you'll have different expected exposure. So for example, here you'll have a distribution. Take the expected positive exposure. Here you'll have a distribution. Take the expected positive exposure. Here we'll have a distribution. Take the expected, take the EE basically. And then for all the EE values that you have, take the grand average. So you have only one value. It's not a function of T. It's one value over the life of the instrument. Okay, and then we have effective expected exposure, EEE, which is a non-decreasing EET. So the idea is basically to retain conservatism. What it means is, if the EE profile is something like this, okay, it goes up and then goes down. When it goes down, you don't take that part. You only keep the increasing version. Okay, so let's say it went from 9 to 10, then from 10 again it went to 9, then you don't take it as 9, you take it as 10. So it's a non-decreasing version of EE. Okay, this is to bring more conservatism, that my exposure is not decreasing. Okay, it will be always the highest achieved so far. It will never decrease. And on this profile, if you take the average, it's EEPE. Right, again, this doesn't have a T. This is a typo. Effective expected positive exposure, which is the grand average of a non-decreasing version of EE. All right, so these things are there. In today's discussion, EE and ENE will be used pretty much everywhere because these are fundamental building blocks for the xVA calculation. PFE and this are used for capitalizing counterparty credit risk. That is not part of today's discussion. That is part of risk management. Today, we are focusing on xVA, valuation adjustments. Okay, so we'll see how everything is calculated. All right, let's proceed. So first issue with the risk neutral valuation is, where are you capturing the risk of counterparty defaulting? In the risk neutral valuation, we never talked about default of anything, right? Default of a counterparty. But this is a real thing, right? And just as in credit risk, we have something called as bad debt expense. And that is a provision that is made for ECL, expected credit loss, which is to account for potential default of the obligor, which is PD times LGD times EAD, right? That is in credit risk. Same idea here. The only difference is EAD part is not deterministic, it's a stochastic component. So we take expectation, right? But the idea is same. Do a valuation adjustment based on the counterparty's default risk. That's CVA. CVA stands for credit value adjustment. This version that we are going to discuss right now is actually called UCVA, which stands for unilateral credit value adjustment, for good reason that I will explain a little later. Okay, so let's understand. So we said that counterparty default risk needs to be priced in, similar to ECL for bad loans. Now this is the definition of expected loss. So it's very simple actually. Don't get intimidated by the notations. It's very simple. First component is when, first of all, is the counterparty defaulting in over the life of the instrument or not? So this indicator function 1, tau less than t, basically denotes whether or not the counterparty, so tau is the default time. Tau is the default time of the counterparty If this is less than T, that means that counterparty is defaulting in the or before the maturity. And if this happens, only then I will have loss. If counterparty defaults after capital T, then there is no loss. It's the, it's set, final settlement is done. So we have a indicator function. This follows Bernoulli distribution, obviously. Right. Only if this, so this takes value 1 or 0, right? Only if this happens, we have a loss. How much loss? Well, if the default happens at tau, what is your positive exposure at that point? Remember, you only lose if you have a positive exposure. If you have a negative exposure, you don't lose. Actually, you owe money to the defaulting counterparty. What is your positive exposure at the time when the counterparty is defaulting? Simple. Discount that to today. This is my valuation date. This is where I'm standing right now. I am trying to capture expected loss. Use a discounting factor to discount the discount from tau to T. That's the discounting factor. But you don't lose everything. You can recover some. So this part is the LGD. It's the same PD times EAD times LGD. The only thing is EAD. For EAD, you use a discounting factor, and is the expected value of the positive exposure. Okay, so as I explained, the second part is the positive EAD discounted to valuation date. The last term is loss given default of the CP. LGD, 1 minus recovery rate, right? All of these are, random. Actually, if you see, this is a random variable. This is a random variable. This can be, cannot be, maybe not, depending on your assumption. Okay. And everybody takes this as constant. It's easy. Take recovery rate as a flat 40% or 50%, whatever. So this thing can come outside. Okay. Now let's make this expression a little more proper under continuous domain, right? And then we will have a discretized version of it, which is actually what is implemented. Okay, you can also work with the continuous version as well. Now, this formula will be a little messy, okay? So what I request you to be a little more patient. I will break it down for you. Each and every component I'll clearly explain. And this formula is very important because this is our first formula for CVA. Because it is, if you see, all the xVAs kind of share the same pattern. 90% of the time, 95% of the time, you'll see the formulas are similar between xVAs. So please pay attention. Okay. All right. So we are standing here, small time t. This is where the instrument maturity. Now we are talking about the counterparty defaulting anywhere in between small t to capital T. Okay, so let's say expectation is an integral, right? It'll be a messy integration, but I'll break it down to you. It's actually very, very simple. Don't worry about it. Consider any small time interval, s to s plus ds. The length of this is ds, all right? We are contemplating what is all of these guys in this interval, and then we'll take an integration. So first one is, one more thing for convenience, we assume this guy and this guy are independent, okay? That means there is no wrong way risk or right way risk. Today, we are not going to discuss about wrong way, right way risk. Those are a little advanced concept, and we cannot obviously cram everything into this small 1.5 hour session. So for ease of modeling, we'll assume these two are independent. Now, what happens when you take expectation of x times y? If x and y are independent, that is expectation of x times expectation of y. So we can separate out. All right. Okay. So if we take the expectation of the Bernoulli, it is actually just PD, right? Probability of default is the expectation. So what is the probability of default of the counterparty in this small time interval? That's the first thing that we are going to look at. The expected value of the counterparty defaulting, it's a 1-0. We know, right, but in Bernoulli, the expectation is just P. So that's PD, right? PD is the expectation of this indicator variable. The probability of default within this small time interval would be probability that it survived till S. Yes, it is called marginal PD, exactly. Probability that it survived till S, then defaulted within this small instant, okay? Probability that it survived till S is e to the power minus, so we know when lambda is constant, the survival probability is e to the power minus lambda t. But if the hazard rate, lambda c is the hazard rate. If hazard rate is variable in a deterministic way, not in a stochastic way, then we take integration, right? Integrate hazard rates up to this point, e to the power minus integral lambda c du. U goes from t to s, right? That is this part is the survival probability till this point. Then multiplied by lambda at s ds. That's it actually is, we call it force of mortality. If you reflect the constant hazard rate model, the marginal probability of default is lambda e to the power minus lambda t. That's the same thing I have done here. The only difference is the variable, the hazard rate is variable. That's all. Okay. So this is the survival probability times default rate within this interval would be lambda c s times ds. Right. So this is the marginal default probability within that interval. Now, what is the next term? Next term is discounting factor. Discounting factor is so if the counterparty defaults here, my exposure here is Vs plus. Marginal PD is given by this. Discounting factor, assuming R is also stochastic, just keeping everything general, not doing any simplification. This would be the discounting factor, right? E to the power minus, if it is constant, then it will be e to the power minus R S minus T, but I'll just keep it as S. That's the discounting factor, right? What else we have? Yeah, that's all pretty much. So this is my final expression for CVA. Recovery, 1 minus recovery, which is the LGD, because it is constant, it came out. No issues with that. Then we integrate this random variable, right? Expectation is an integral. This part and ds captures the marginal default probability multiplied by expected discounted positive exposure at that point, Vs. Now this S will go from small t to capital T to capture the entire life of the instrument, because counterparty can default at any point between T to capital T. I'll pause here, reflect on the equation. If you did not understand any component, let me know. I'll explain again. Everyone sort of kind of clear? This equation is very, very important, because all of the xVAs have a exactly same pattern. Same terms will appear over and over and over. So question from Rahul, can you explain the lambda function? Sure. How do you remember what this is called? Lambda, the hazard rate. It's a rate, right? When you multiply a rate with the time, it becomes the default percentage, right? Default rate times a time gives you the default percentage. Default percentage of what? How many people survived? Isn't that the PD? The marginal PD means the probability of default within this interval, and that is given as you have survived till this point, which is this guy, e to the power minus lambda t, lambda s minus t, times default rate, conditional default rate, Because it is conditional, it has to be multiplied with the surviving population here. This is the surviving population or surviving probability, same thing. Times default rate times how much time are you allowing. That will give you the actual default probability. So that's how it is. Okay. I don't have the pen, but if you consider the constant hazard rate model, let's do a mental exercise. Here we have default time. On the y-axis you have the hazard, default probability, the survival probability, which is exponentially decaying, right? And then we have, so at any point the height of the PDF is lambda e to the power minus lambda t. That's the PDF. And then in a small area, you take that height, which is lambda e to the power minus lambda t times dt. That gives you the marginal default probability. The only difference is here I don't have a constant hazard rate model. I have a variable hazard rate. So I have to take integration from t to s. That is what I've taken. U is just a local variable between t to s. This is to facilitate the integration. That's all. Okay. Okay. I hope this makes sense. Now, don't worry about this because we will perform a discrete implementation of the same idea, which is relatively straightforward. Actually, is very easy. This one is very easy. So we will break down the entire time t to t into small chunks, right? The choice of the discrete time step depends very much on the contract, right? You have to consider operational efficiency, and if there are path dependency, then all those things come into picture in terms of what is the discretization step that I need to consider. Okay, so let's say at ti, I will have some expected exposure. Let's call that ei. At ti plus 1, I'll have ei plus 1. Okay, since I'm taking the average of the positive exposure, which I know E of V plus is EE. Expectation of V plus is EE. Okay. But I'm taking the discounted positive exposure and expectation of that. So what practitioners use is this version. In between this interval, actually, there are 2 points, right? And the EE can be different at these two extremes. So instead of picking one value, why not take the average of these two to reflect the overall discounted EE in this interval? All right. So what they use is this. So see this. First term is same, LGD. Okay. Marginal PD is very simply the difference of the two survival probabilities here and here. Survival probability decreases always. You take the survival probability here minus survival probability here, that will give you the marginal PD. Okay, so that's what this part is, marginal PD times expected discounted EE, right? This is my expected discounted EE. Expectation has already happened. Discounting function I'm taking, but I'm taking in a clever way so that, not to be biased. Basically, this is the trapezoidal rule. Right? Expected V plus is EE, and this is the discounting factor. So since I have these two extremes at the interval, let me take EEI times the discounting factor plus on the other extreme, the other EE times the discounting factor, and then take the average of both to reflect the overall discounted EE in this interval. Okay, I think this is very, very straightforward. All the components are very, very transparent. Right? So yeah, this is how we will implement. This is easy. And remember, there is a strong assumption in this formula that there is no wrong way risk. That means this guy and this guy are totally independent. Exposure is not related to the default event. That is important. In our PD, LGD, EAD framework also, that is an assumption. We do not assume any correlation between PD and LGD. And only because of that, we are able to take, expectation of X times Y as expectation of X times expectation of Y. Same thing we have done here as well. Okay, question from Rohit. Can you please explain why we take average of EE once more? Well, so see, this is an interval. If I ask you, what is the value of expected exposure in this interval? What would be the answer? There are three terms. We have to take the LGD, which is constant throughout. That's good news. We have to take the product of PD in this interval, which is conveniently given by this, no issues, times expected exposure in this interval times discounting factor from here to T. Now you tell me, what is the EE and DF I should take? It's a whole interval. Should I take this one or this one? Better yet is to take average of both. Kind of like an interpolation, you can say, is also a trapezoidal rule. When you try to calculate the area, you can take, this is my width, no issues. Width time height, which height should I take? This height or this height or average of these two heights? Okay, so this goes back to Riemann's integral, if you are aware. Sometimes we take the left height. You can also take the right. You can also take the middle one, which is the trapezoidal rule. That is more, accurate. So this is preferred. Make sense? Any other outstanding question? If you are comfortable with this slide, other things will be very easy because I'll be using the same formula again and again and again. Okay. Any other question? Speak now or forever hold your peace. Just kidding. Okay, let's proceed. Question from Anurag. Can you please explain survival probability again? Probability of default in an interval is the difference between survival probabilities at the two extremes. That's standard. Okay. If you understand the relationship between survival probability, cumulative probability, marginal default probability, and conditional default probability, all four you need to be very clear. But this is, so basically your cumulative probability of default keeps increasing. Survival probability keeps decreasing. And this is a very nice relationship. The marginal probability of default can be expressed as difference of cumulative probabilities or difference of survival probability. Same thing, but you have to change the sign. Sometimes, it's the first one minus the second one for the survival probability. For cumulative probability, it's increasing. So you take the second one minus the first one. Both will give you the same answer, which is the marginal probability. Okay. Is the incremental default probability. Think like that. So how much the survival probability has decreased in that interval? That's the marginal default probability. This is the decrease. Okay. All right. What was the, okay. So we understood UCVA, which is unilateral CVA. The reason it is called as unilateral is because bank is calculating the CVA, anticipating the default risk of the counterparty. It's a unilateral calculation because bank did not think about its own default probability. Bank did not think about its own default probability. Question from Abhishek. PD will come from IRB. No, it typically comes from CDS spread. Okay, IRB practice is different. Here, it's a little different. We actually bootstrap and construct the PD term structure from the CDS spread. It has to be market implied. Okay. Yes, we will use that equation. I'll show you a little bit later. Now let's focus on this. From UCVA, we are going to BCVA, which is bilateral, right? The reason is, what are the issues with UCVA? First of all, we said that it is called UCVA because it stands for unilateral CVA, which only talks about the counterparty's default probability, not your own default probability. All right. Second one is, if you only use that CVA, the bank's valuation and the counterparty's valuation will never agree. the same instrument, but two parties will be valuing it differently, because bank will adjust the CVA reflecting counterparty's default risk. Counterparty will adjust CVA reflecting bank's default risk. Since the CVA valuations will be different because both have different PD term structure, right? Recovery rates, everything. So the price is asymmetrical. They cannot come to an agreement. So that created a problem, in the community. So they wanted to restore the price symmetry so that both parties can agree. So that being the inspiration, they came up with a modified formula which reflects the default event of both the parties, not just one. So this is the modified formula. Now, don't worry, there is just a tiny, tiny adjustment. If you see in the bilateral CVA, what I have done here is explicitly I'm calling out so the first term remains the same till this point. Tau C is the default time of the counterparty. Counterparty must be defaulting before the life of the instrument for you to have a loss, correct? Exposure, positive exposure for you at tau C, because this is the default time of the counterparty. This remains the same, discounting, that's fine. LGD of the counterparty, right? That's fine. But here is a new term. You as a bank have to survive till this point. The entire expression only makes sense if you survive till that point. That means you default after the counterparty's default. Your default time must be after the counterparty's default time. You must be able to survive at tau C to have that loss. If you default before the counterparty, then obviously this loss doesn't make sense. So we weight the whole expression by probability of you surviving till tau C. All right. But that's not the only case. Now there is another term. Think from the counterparty's perspective. If you default before the counterparty, that actually is like a fictitious benefit. It's not a loss, because if you default before the counterparty, then if you owe the money to the counterparty, you don't have to give him. If you are defaulted, you cannot give the money. If you owe money to the counterparty and you default, then you do not have to give that money. That kind of acts like a gain, right? It's a benefit, and it's very controversial. People went crazy in the community when this term was added. There were benefits in terms of it brought the price symmetry. Accounting people were very happy because for them, the left side, right side has to always check out, right? From an accounting perspective, it made sense. But because of your own default, you are realizing a profit again. That is not so counterintuitive. So this was controversial. Okay, so let's look at the second term. Second term is the exact opposite. You're talking about your own default. See, bank's default before T. Negative exposure, important, because it is when you owe money to the counterparty. When you owe money to the counterparty and you default, then you don't have to pay that. So that's the benefit. This is the same. It's your own LGD, okay? But counterparty also has to survive. You are defaulting, but counterparty has to survive when you are defaulting. Now, the whole thing is very, very symmetrical. Okay, we are considering the default of both are defaultable, not just the counterparty. So that's bilateral CVA. And the second term is called as, who can tell me what is the second term called as? Wow, okay, DVA. All right. Perfect. So as we mentioned, this is the loss when the bank survives, but the counterparty defaults and counterparty owes money to the bank. This part is reflected here. It has to be a positive exposure. And the second one is, again, when bank defaults, but the counterparty survives and bank owes money to the counterparty. That's the DVA. Together, they are called as bilateral CVA. Okay, so here is the expression. Same expression. There are two terms, obviously. The only thing that you have to be careful with is what lambda you're using. See, first one concerns with default of the counterparty. So I have the hazard rate of the counterparty here. Okay. LGD of the counterparty here. VS plus has to be positive exposure for the bank to capture the loss. All of these is fine. Now notice this term. This is extra. It was not there earlier. So e to the power minus integral lambda b du represents survival probability of the bank. What is the survival probability formula? E to the power minus lambda t, right? So e to this inclusion, e to the power minus lambda b u du is the survival probability till s. S, remember, S is the interval, S to S plus ds is the interval where we are focusing this particular term, and then we are integrating the whole thing. This additional term represents this part, survival probability of the bank till S. Make sense? And second expression is the same. You just replace C with B everywhere. But this part is remain symmetric. So here we are capturing the default probability of the bank, but e to the power minus lambda c u du represents the survival probability of the counterparty till S. And this has to be VS minus because it has to be negative exposure. Only then you owe the money to the counterparty. Are you clear with this? I think I have the discretized version as well. Yeah, discretized version is the same. Everything is same. There are two differences. One difference is you have to include the survival probability. Okay, if you're talking about counterparty CVA part, then you have to include your own survival probability. If you're talking about DVA part, then you have to include counterparty survival probability as a factor. And EEDF is the same, but in the second one, you have to have ENE because ENE is the expected negative exposure. Expected negative exposure. That's ENE. Right? So you're taking the negative exposures and taking expectation. That's what you have to use. That's all. So this is BCVA. So this still remain controversial. There are some merits to this, but again, this DVA part was very, very sort of counterintuitive and controversial. Okay, let's move on. Now, one of you asked me, how do we go about calculating PD? So basically, it's very simple. We look at the CDS curve. If the CDS curve of the counterparty or the bank is not available, then we use some kind of proxy. So that becomes subjective. On the x-axis, we have years. Y-axis, we have the CDS spread, which is in basis points. First formula is the hazard rate is given by this corresponding spread divided by 1 minus R. This is an approximate formula. Then we have survival probability. Remember, survival probability is e to the power minus lambda t times t. So survival probability would be e to the power minus, just replace lambda, spread divided by 1 minus R times t. If you have the survival probability as a function of time, you can calculate marginal probability of default between any two time intervals very easily. This is the difference of survival probabilities. Survival probability at Ti minus survival probability at Ti plus 1. So this is how you will calculate the marginal PD, and you'll plug it in that equation everywhere. Okay, straightforward stuff. It's actually not straightforward. Everything that we are discussing today in a rapid fire fashion is typically a whole chapter in the book. There are many practical caveats that one has to be careful with. But today we are all talking about foundation and the big moving parts. So yeah. Now, how do we modify this formula if there is a netting set? Okay. So what if there is netting? It as in there are multiple trades, okay, and all of those trades are part of one netting set. What did we discuss about netting set? We need to simply add the exposures, plus minus, plain vanilla add. That's the whole purpose of netting, to reduce the exposure overall. The formula gets modified like this. Very simple. Keep everything intact take the sum of V. Sum as in, let's say you have two trades, it will be V1 plus V2 here, V1 plus V2 here, that's all. Now it is very, very important that first you take the sum and then you take the positive part of it. And then you take the expectation. That's the sequence. Netting means you add the raw exposures together. Do not take the positive part first and then net them. That doesn't make sense. Okay. First you do the netting as is on the raw exposures, then you just plug in this equation as is. That's all you need to do in presence of netting. All right. Yeah, positive net exposure, negative net exposure. I did not call it net positive exposure. Otherwise, that will be, it might be confusing. Do not do the positive action first. Do the netting action first, and then you take the positive part. And then you take the expectation, right? Okay, the next credit risk mitigant we have is collateral. Now, this is a little involved. I think we should probably take a break after this. I will need, I think, half an hour to 40 minutes more to wrap up everything, including the Python tutorial on this one. All right. Okay. In presence of collateral, what we need to do is, when it comes to OTC derivatives, right, it's all driven by the ISDA master document, and that specifies all the various different clauses and protocols of the trade, including CSA. CSA is a very important aspect. CSA stands for Credit Support Annexure, which talks about the collateral arrangements. Okay. Yeah. So in CSA, there are a couple of terms which are called TH, threshold, and then MTA, minimum transfer amount. As we discussed briefly, threshold is like the exposure that you are willing to take in an unsecured fashion. You are not bothered until TH, right? If the counterparty owes you money, let's say your threshold is $100, and if the counterparty owes you only $50, you don't worry about it. Like, I can tolerate till 100. That's my threshold, right? Similarly, MTA, if there is a collateral transfer needed, it has to be higher than MTA. Doesn't make sense to transfer pennies and few dollars, right? Minimum transfer amount, is there to handle the improve the operational efficiency, so that we don't end up transferring small amounts. And okay, now when there is collateral, from a counterparty credit risk perspective, since we are talking about default event, right? At default, you are able to recover the loss from the collateral by selling in the market, right? So what you are exposed is the residual exposure, which is basically your raw exposure minus the collateral value. That is what you are worried about. In the presence of collateral, your formula gets modified. Instead of taking the raw value of the derivative, which is the exposure, you take the residual exposure by offsetting the collateral that you are holding. Okay. Yeah, that's all. So yeah, and there is another point is important. I know I'm rushing everything because it's really, there are a lot of stuff and we have very limited time. Again, today's session is to lay out the foundation, and you will explore each and every topic at your own pace. Obviously, we'll do everything one by one in the upcoming classes in the course. Another concept is margin period of risk. So what happens is, because you have these frictions introduced, right? Collateral transfer also takes time. It is not instantaneous. Correct? So let's say counterparty owes you collateral. By the time it comes to you, there is a delay. What if the counterparty has defaulted in that period and you don't know it? It takes time, right? So potentially, what is the time period for which you remain vulnerable? The total time period for which you remain vulnerable in that vulnerability period, your exposure can go up to any extent. So that total vulnerability period is defined as the time when you got the last collateral or margin posted. Apparently that neutralized your exposure. From that point all the way up to counterparty defaulting, declaring that he is default, and then you are getting ready to replace those transactions in the market with a new counterparty. That entire time, for that entire time period, your exposure could be increasing because it's based on market factors, right? So that entire time period for which you are vulnerable and your exposure can go up to any extent, right? You cannot have collateral in that period. So that's called margin period of risk. And when we provision capital, we have to take care of the margin period of risk. That's like the conservative estimate of the vulnerable time during which my exposure can blow up. All right. Okay. Now, in presence of collateral, how do we want to adjust the BCVA formula? The best way, there are shortcuts also. There are shortcut methods, but those are not accurate. The accurate way, which is obviously the most expensive way, is to put everything under a Monte Carlo routine so that you can perfectly replicate the collateral transfer. Because see, there are a lot of different frictions. There is threshold, there is MTA. So at every time step, you have to see what is the value of the trade, how much collateral you already hold. Now, based on the simulation, you will find the value of the trade in the next time step, right? What is the collateral that needs to be transferred by checking all these conditions? So you dynamically, keep a record of the value of the trade and the evolution of collateral. Keep a record of these two, okay? And keep measuring your residual exposure at every time point. And then use that in the equation. Okay, I know this is complicated, so that's why we'll not be covering this in today's session. It will take a lot of time. Right? But I'll tell you the whole mechanics. So you can implement it yourself. It's not that difficult, actually. It's just setting this up takes time. Okay. So we basically, discretize into small time steps. At every time step, we are keeping an account of the value of the trade and the collateral held. And in the next time step, if we need how much collateral will come to us, or we have to return the collateral, that also exists. So let's look at the conditions. You have to use these. Okay. So you're standing here. Okay. Value of the trade is VTI. The collateral transfer is required only if the value above and beyond threshold, right, is higher than the collateral held, already held. This is how much you're already holding. This is the threshold. So you first subtract the threshold to see how much exposure is there above and beyond threshold, and is that sufficiently collateralized? If not, if there is some gap, then that becomes the additional collateral that you need to demand from the counterparty. Okay, this is the amount of collateral that needs to be transferred, provided your current value is higher than the threshold. If it is lower than threshold, don't even think about collateral, right? If the exposure is less than threshold, you are not worried at all. And this transfer amount that you calculated must exceed minimum transfer amount. So in the Monte Carlo step, you have to have an if condition. And if these two are true, this is the collateral that will get added to the already existing collateral. You have this new collateral value. And this value keeps, you simulate this based on your risk factor and pricing function. So that's in a separate track. This is in a separate track. Okay, so at every point in time, you are keeping a record of the value of the trade. It could be one trade, it could be multiple trades also, not a problem. And then keep a track of the collateral. Okay, there are other conditions as well. So let's look at those. If the value of the trade is higher than threshold, but the collateral that you calculated is less than MTA, then there is no transfer of collateral. Then there is no transfer of collateral. Then the last condition is, if the value of the trade goes down the threshold, below the threshold, you actually return the collateral. The collateral that you hold no longer applies because your exposure is even less than threshold. So you don't need to, keep the collateral. So you return the collateral. So using these if-else condition, you have to model the collateral. Okay, makes sense? Any questions? The whole thing, you have to put it in a Monte Carlo routine and you'll get the accurate evolution of trade as well as collateral. This is reflecting the variation margin. If you have initial margin also, it gets a little complicated, right? Initial margin calculation is dependent on the volatility of the trade, and that becomes really complicated. But it is there. You can model both. All right. So based on the collateral value, your CVA formulation becomes adjusted. How do you adjust this? In the positive exposure or negative exposure part, right? You need to calculate the residual exposure. You need to calculate the residual exposure. So if the counterparty is defaulting at tau C, there is a small caveat here. We do not offset it by the collateral which is available at that default time. We actually take the collateral that is available to us. This should have been actually tau C. There is a typo. Before an MPOR period. Okay, so this is to reflect the true conservatism, in terms of modeling the exposure. At the time when he's defaulting, the collateral you have could be a MPOR days before that default time, because this is the time till which you do not receive anything. MPOR is the maximum time for which there is no collateral transfer. So to be conservative, you offset with the collateral that was available before, MPOR days from the time of default. And everything else remains the same. Okay. Yeah, and as Bhuvan commented, if we have threshold, we actually don't require initial margin. They kind of duplicate their purpose. Okay, I hope you understood this at a high level. I know there are a lot of different nuances to it. So once you deploy the entire algorithm in Monte Carlo, you will see that it is not that easy. A lot of calculations are there. Okay, so let's do one thing. Let's take a break for 5 minutes here, and then we will resume. All right, see you after 5 minutes.